Thank you. Okay, so the second half will be about metadata extractors. This will be a pretty high-level overview, and we'll emphasize some of the kind of new improvements and changes. But I'm pretty sure that in future webinars, we'll probably have to kind of revisit extractors and talk about more of the specifics. So one of the kind of unique aspects of Clowder is this idea that as you upload data to the system, there is a bunch of what we call metadata extractors running in the background based on that data that was just uploaded. And traditionally, this just happened automatically. So for example, if you would upload that image on the left, then what you would get on the right, depending on your setup, your Clowder setup, would be things like the EXIF information at the top with channel depth and resolution and color space. Perhaps you would get information about the fact that an image, a human face, was detected in this image. If you had the OCR extractor deployed, you might get down below the words of what's in that image in the tag about the web browser. Maybe you have the green index extractor that tells you how many green pixels, how much green is in that image. And so that's in a nutshell, that's what, that's unique, somewhat unique to Clowder. And traditionally, it was if you had the extractor deployed, you would get this information, and it was up to you to just kind of make sense of it and use it and so on. That's where we started. And just as a reminder, just briefly, this is something that behind the scenes go over an extraction bus. So you have these messages go out, published, and then you have these extractors picking them up. And so these extractors can run anywhere on the cloud. You can scale them out. You can do all sorts of things. So as we talk about extractors, we'll go back to this idea of the bus and the messages that go over this bus. Specifically, the current implementation uses RabbitMQ. One last thing, you can have multiple instances of Clowder in the front end, share extractors across them if you want to. Okay, so a small parenthesis, back to the user-facing. It is actually the case that you can, if you want, manually submit to an extractor a file or a data set. And so we have GUI where you can do that. So for example, here is, I've picked a file, and these are the compatible extractors for that file. Based on the file MIME type and another thing, and you can click submit, and then you can manually submit it. So it's not the case that it will always run. You can actually turn it off and then run it as need be, or run it multiple times. You can do the same thing with DATASET. The list might look different because we have extractors that work on datasets and extractors that work on files. One of the things that it's not clear to most is that when you do that same submission, a file to an extractor, that if you do that to the API, you can actually provide parameters. This is something that we're asked quite a bit about. We have some really basic support, but if you do the submission, so this is a submission to the extractor NCSA word count of a specific file there at the top, what you can see is that you can have a parameter subdocument with an arbitrary nested set of key value pairs. That's available right now. One of the things that we're currently working on, Mike Lambert has started this work, it's still in development, is this ability of being able to set parameters through the UI, through the GUI. So here's an example specific to some extractors that he's working on. One of the things that we're trying to do here is also kind of define what these key value pairs are. Currently, that's not defined anywhere. So you will have to know how the extractor is implemented to actually know what to submit. We've also improved the extraction event UI. So when you go to a file or a data set, you'll get a lot more information about what extractors ran on that file or data set, and what steps they went through. Some of these are standardized in some of our libraries and extractors. Some of them are up to the extractor. So you have the freedom as the extractor developer to actually log as much as you want and send it back to the front end. So I mentioned that now it's not that extractors automatically run, you can turn them on and off. So what this shows you is how you turn them on and off. There's two places where you can do this. One is at the global level, so this is as a super admin of Clowder. You can go there and say, for any data uploaded to Clowder to this instance, I want, for example, the NCSA GeoTIFF preview to run. You do that in this page, only available to admins, super admins. But you can also do that in a space page. So if you're not familiar with Clowder, when you create a data set or a collection, you can keep it private to yourself or share it with a project space. And so what we see here is that I can say, well, for all files and data set uploaded to this particular space, I also want the image green index to execute on it automatically. If you look closely, the NCSA GeoTIFF preview is checked, and you can't change that, because the logic right now is such that if somebody as a super admin says that one extractor needs to run, it will always run. So you can't override that at the space level yet, but you can add to that list. I will also mention that this page has a lot of information about extractors, including the process triggers. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And that information is also available in a new page where the extractor information, so for each extractor, we actually now require every extractor to have this information defined. We now have a user interface to look at this information through the Clowder UI, but behind the scenes, this information is defined as a JSON document together with the extractor, so it's deployed with the extractor. And that information, this is an example of that information. That information is now required. While before extractors could register themselves with the Clowder front end without this, now this is required. Furthermore, and this is a little bit technical, but while before, if you were an extractor developer, you knew that your extractor, when it came online, it would register itself using the API and say, I'm available, here's my information. Now this is all done through RabbitMQ behind the scenes. So there's a queue that basically every so often gets these messages with extractor info. And so what you see on the front end is kind of being updated from these extractors in the back end. And we have a lot more information about the number of extractors running in the back end, and when they come down and they come back up, that we are actually sending back to Clowder that we do not show on the GUI, on the UI right now, but that we plan on showing there, so admins can get a better sense, and also users, they might see, oh look, this particular extractor is offline right now, and maybe you get in touch with one of the administrators. We also have added the ability of canceling submission to an extractor because there is this publish subscribe but if you have a job and there's a lot of job ahead of you and you change your mind. Before we didn't have a way to cancel that extraction. Now we do. We have to do some tricky stuff with how we basically cache the messages before and after. So there's some magic happening behind the scenes. But now we do have a button that allows you to say, well, I've changed my mind or I've accidentally submitted something. I need to change the parameters and all of that, and so you can cancel it. So briefly, when it comes to developing Extractor, we have some updates. So traditionally, we always told people that you can go and use the PyClowder library to develop extractors. This library is a Python library that has support for all the basic functionality of extractors. So we really encourage people to look at this library when developing a new extractor. It has also some support for high-performance computing resources. We do have a Java-based library that is not, we try to maintain it. It's somewhat experimental at this point. We have had some users use it to develop extractors. And also, as a fallback, there's always the ability of writing extractors from scratch. And we have had just recently on the Brown Dog project, somebody who developed a Scala-based library, an extractor, doing that. And it was really interesting to see the process they went through in terms of knowing how to communicate both with RabbitMQ as well as the API. There's a lot of boilerplate code in PyClowder that we kind of take for granted when using PyClowder, but we really should be documenting exactly everything that is required from an extractor if somebody wants to write an extractor from scratch. We have a new way of writing extractors, a new simplified way of writing extractors that is within PyClowder. So there's two flavors of it. One is the Python simple extractor. This allows you to take a Python function. For example, here's a Python function on the right, word count. That's the entirety of the extractor. It's just a few lines. It calls the word count Linux command, and then it takes the output, puts in a Python map, and just sends it back to Clowder. This is really easy. You write the function, you provide the extractor info, the manifest that we talked about previously, and then you have to provide a Docker file, which the basic one is really simple. It's a couple of lines, but of course, if you need special libraries, you can put them in there. So right now, when somebody gets started, for the simple use cases, we really kind of point them to this Python simple extractor. Another flavor of this is an R simple extractor, which is basically the same thing, but you can take an R function and use that as your extractor. And we would like to add more languages and support for more frameworks. So if you have any ideas, please share them with us. So this is a little bit more technical, and I apologize, there's a lot of kind of technical information here, but I think it's important to understand when talking about Extractor and developing Extractor and what they can do. So in the past, we had all sort of RabbitMQ queues like that we had to track to support the extractors. That has been simplified quite a bit. So now you don't have to worry about this as a developer anymore. Also, when we send this message out, initially, if you remember, it was primarily driven by this idea is here's a file, and now run on this file, and that's all that you could do. And so the message that was sent over RabbitMQ was a simple JSON document with just a few fields. Over time, the type of things that we have started doing with extractors has increased, and we have a lot more variety. So we actually have extended this, and now live, we have a lot more information on the message. And it's really important to understand because it shows you, and I'll say this in a little bit, but basically what you have is you have a much more flexible extractor. So if you have new types of events and new things you want to try to track as Clowder, as things happen in the front end to notify the extractors in the back end, you can do that. So for example, this is, if you look closely, here at the bottom, you see the activity is created, and the source type is a file. So what we're saying is a file with this idea has been created, and then there's a bunch of other information, but that's pretty much it. So this is kind of like the old type of message, the basic one. Here's an example which is a little bit more involved. This is a, if you look at the bottom, activity says removed, and the routing key is Clowder dataset file removed. And at the top, the source is a file with an ID, and the target is a dataset with an ID. So basically, this is a message that gets sent over when a file is removed from a dataset. And so we have a lot of flexibility also to add more of these types of events and have Extractor support them. These are the ones that we currently support. So these are basically independently from what Extractor are running. When a file is uploaded, it's added to a data set, is removed from a data set, metadata is added, removed, file data sets are manually submitted, a bunch of files are uploaded from the GUI, these messages go out, and you can write your own extractor to listen to those and do some more extensive, some more sophisticated work on the extractor end. Finally, one of the things that we have started doing, so some of this is present in the current release, is this idea of, when we started, we focused on metadata extraction, but then what we ended up doing with Extractor is more and more and more that was, not really metadata extraction. I mean, you could classify it as that, but they had very specific types of things that we were doing with them. And so recently we started saying, well, we want to keep using the extraction bus, what we call now the extraction bus, to do this kind of work because it helps us scale out to, high traffic and high workloads and large files and so on. And so we started saying, well, can we keep reusing it, but also using it in other areas? So right now, a lot of extractors do the first two. They extract metadata and add it to, a file or data set, or they create a preview. Well, we have some work that we have done where we can convert file formats, and there is a plugin in Clowder where you can enable it. Well, it would be a lot easier for us to deploy and for anyone to kind of deploy if there were extractors that were tagged as convert, they're extractors that convert file formats, and maybe they only show up in certain aspects of the GUI and they only get used in certain activities within Clowder. Same thing with archival. We have been developing some archival functionality, ability to archive files. move them from one backend resource to another. Well, wouldn't it be nice, if we can use the extraction bus, and that's what we're doing, but we don't want archive to show up in the interface, to randomly submit with parameters, a file to an archival extractor. Same thing with publish. We had the seed, the NSF project. We had a staging area to publish dataset to long-term repositories. Where would it be nice if this was extractors? Workflows and silent are also some more advanced use cases. Workflows, there's a lot of this work done in TerraRef where you have multiple extractors that have to be organized and coordinated. And silent, we have extractors that log a lot of information, but automatically, but really we don't want to see that in the GUI because it's more for backend admin to use, not really for the user to see. So this is available here, and we continue to kind of build upon this moving forward. So that concludes this section of the presentation. So we have time for another question related to this part, to extractors, and then we'll have a couple of concluding slides about the webinar. So any questions about extractors, metadata extractors, or not extractors? By the way, we need a new term potentially for them. So if you have any ideas, please think about it and share on Slack and mail us. Questions? All right. Yep.
You go to the URL for PyClower?
Yes. You want to go to it?
No, actually, later today I'll change it to be PyClower, not PyClower 2.
Right. So that was Rob Cooper, and PyClower 2 was embedded. The version of PyClower was embedded in the name of the repository, and we're starting to be a little bit more formal about versioning, and it's obviously creating issues. And there is a PyClower 3 being planned in the works, so that might be something for future topics to cover, as well as maybe a quick tutorial on how to use the simple extractors to write extractors. So I guess that leads us into the kind of last slide. So we'll have a webinar in October, ideally the first Friday of October. Tentatively, we might have Todd Nicholson present some work that they've been doing related to a phone app, client phone app for Clowder, written in Flutter. We need another topic, so if you would like to volunteer, please go to Slack and the mailing list and submit your ideas. Even if it's not for October, it's later on. We basically just need to keep, build this kind of set of future presentations as we move forward. Our goal is to try to have 2 every month. So we have a few more minutes. That's it. So maybe, are there any questions about the webinars or even the Clowder developer meetings that will happen the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Friday of the month? If there are no questions, I guess I'll have some closing comments. So as I've said at the beginning, we need your help in making sure that we have users and people interested in Clowder joining these webinars. This is our first webinar, but we really need your help. And one of the things that, even though we have notified a lot of our collaborators about this webinar, my feeling is that they feel like it's potentially very technical. And there might be, like today, we talked about some technical aspects, but we really want students, collaborators, researchers, users, not just developers, to join these webinars. So please help us kind of advertise. So if you have projects that use Clowder or collaborators that might be interested in it, please feel free to send these invites along and help us build the webinars moving forward. Furthermore, if you have ideas on how to make these, as useful and productive as possible, also, speak up and let us know and help us make this, this series successful as possible. And yes, so the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th week, it'll be the same invite. So if you accidentally show up and there is some, a wild conversation about Scala code, those are developer meetings. We will advertise them both on the Clowder homepage as well as Slack. We haven't done that so far. That will be next, and you're more than welcome to join them. They will be very informal, like I said, so there will be not very strict agenda. It will be more a chance for people to say, well, I'm working on X, I need feedback, so let me talk about it, and let me gather some feedback.
It's also a good place for people to come in and say, hey, I'm working on this great new feature, and I would like for people to play with it a little bit.
Yeah, especially in the initial phases of design and development. But we hope that at some point, you'll present during the webinars, kind of a more formal presentation. Yeah. All right. So thank you for everyone who joined, and we'll hopefully see you in a month or less. Bye-bye.
Bye.